Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other recruits at Fort Bragg. While her fellow soldiers could bench press twice their body weight and run 5 miles without breaking a sweat, Sarah struggled to meet even the basic physical requirements. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and barely weighing 110 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a member of the elite 82nd Airborne Division. The nickname started during her second week of training. Sergeant Collins, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of service, watched Sarah stumble through another obstacle course run and shook his head in disgust. "What the hell is Command thinking, sending us useless baggage like this?" he muttered to his assistant, not caring that Sarah was within earshot. The name stuck like glue, spreading through the barracks faster than gossip at a small-town diner. Sarah's bunkmates whispered it behind her back during evening inspections. Her squad members rolled their eyes when she was assigned to their team for field exercises. Even the mess hall workers seemed to smirk when she approached the serving line, as if they too had heard the stories about the girl who didn't belong in uniform. But what her critics didn't know was that Sarah possessed something far more valuable than brute strength or lightning speed. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of East Los Angeles, she had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger before it materialized. Her grandmother, Maria, used to say that Sarah had los ojos que ven, the eyes that see. While other children played in their yards without a care in the world, Sarah could spot trouble brewing 3 blocks away. This gift had saved her life more times than she could count during her childhood. She knew which corners to avoid when the local gangs were having territorial disputes. She could sense when her alcoholic stepfather was about to explode into one of his violent rages, giving her time to grab her little brother and disappear until the storm passed. Her reflexes weren't just quick, they were intuitive, born from years of navigating a world where letting your guard down for even a moment could prove fatal. The military had been Sarah's escape route from that life. She enlisted the day after her 18th birthday, desperate to break the cycle of poverty and violence that had claimed so many of her childhood friends. The recruiter had been impressed by her test scores and her determination, but he had also been honest about the challenges she would face as a small woman in a male-dominated field. Sarah's first month at basic training was a nightmare of humiliation and self-doubt. During hand-to-hand combat drills, she was consistently overpowered by opponents who outweighed her by 50 pounds or more. Her rifle scores were average at best, and she finished dead last in every endurance run. The other recruits began treating her like a liability, someone they would have to carry rather than count on when the real fighting began. The worst incident happened during a night training exercise in the Georgia swamps. Sarah's squad was tasked with navigating through hostile territory to reach an extraction point before dawn. The mission should have been straightforward, but everything went wrong from the start. Their radio equipment malfunctioned, leaving them cut off from base communications. Then, their squad leader, Corporal Hayes, made a series of poor navigation decisions that led them deeper into the swampland instead of toward their objective. As the hours ticked by and their situation became increasingly desperate, tempers began to flare. Private Johnson, a muscular farm boy from Iowa, finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "This is what happens when they saddle us with dead weight," he said, glaring directly at Sarah. "We're going to fail this exercise because we have to babysit someone who shouldn't even be here." The accusation stung because Sarah knew there was some truth to it. She had been struggling to keep up with the group's pace, and her pack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds after hours of trudging through knee-deep mud and tangled vegetation. But she also knew something that the others hadn't noticed yet. They were being followed. For the past hour, Sarah had been picking up subtle signs that they weren't alone in the swamp. Nothing obvious that would trigger the standard threat detection protocols they had been taught, just tiny irregularities that her street-smart instincts recognized as danger signals. The calls of night birds that stopped and started in patterns that seemed too deliberate. The sound of branches breaking in the distance, always about 2 minutes after their own squad had made similar noises. The feeling of eyes watching them from the darkness beyond their flashlight beams. Sarah tried to warn Corporal Hayes about her suspicions, but he dismissed her concerns with barely concealed irritation. "Martinez, we've got enough real problems to worry about without you imagining bogeymen in the bushes," he snapped. "Focus on putting one foot in front of the other and let the rest of us handle the tactical situation. The rebuke silenced Sarah, but it didn't quiet her growing sense of unease. Her grandmother had taught her to trust her instincts above all else, because in their neighborhood, people who ignored warning signs didn't live long enough to learn from their mistakes. Something was definitely wrong in these woods, and the fact that nobody else seemed to sense it only made her more certain that danger was approaching fast. As they pushed deeper into the swamp, Sarah began to notice other disturbing details. The opposing force team that was supposed to be hunting them should have been using standard military protocols, but the movement patterns she was detecting felt different somehow. More aggressive, more unpredictable, almost like whoever was tracking them wasn't playing by the same rules as everyone else. The thought sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold, damp air of the Georgia night. What if this wasn't just a training exercise anymore? What if something had gone terribly, dangerously wrong? Sarah's mind raced as she tried to piece together the clues. The radio malfunction could have been caused by equipment failure, but it could also have been the result of deliberate jamming. Corporal Hayes's navigation errors might have been honest mistakes, or they might have been the result of someone feeding him false information. And the sounds she was hearing in the darkness might not be coming from their instructors at all, but who would listen to the concerns of someone the entire unit considered useless baggage. Sarah realized with growing dread that even if she was right about the danger they were walking into, she might be the only one who could see it coming in time to do something about it. The swamp stretched endlessly ahead of them, dark and full of secrets. Sarah adjusted her pack and quickened her pace, knowing that whatever test awaited them in the darkness ahead, it would determine not just whether she belonged in this unit, but whether any of them would make it out alive. Behind them, unseen and unheard by everyone except Sarah, the hunters continued to close in. The attack came at 0247 hours, just as Sarah had predicted it would. The squad was crossing a narrow strip of solid ground between two areas of standing water when the night exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies, and the sharp crack of rifle fire shattered the peaceful sounds of the swamp. But these weren't the blank rounds typically used in training exercises. The bullets that whined past Sarah's head and splintered the cypress trees around them were very real and very lethal. Corporal Hayes dropped to the muddy ground and began shouting orders, but his voice was barely audible over the deafening roar of automatic weapons fire. The squad scattered in all directions, seeking whatever cover they could find among the twisted roots and hanging moss. Sarah dove behind a fallen log just as a burst of gunfire chewed through the air where she had been standing moments before. In the brief intervals between volleys, Sarah could hear her fellow soldiers calling out to each other in panic and confusion. Private Johnson was screaming for medical assistance. He had taken a round through his shoulder and was bleeding badly. Private Chun was pinned down in a depression about 20 yards to Sarah's left, unable to move without exposing himself to the crossfire. Corporal Hayes kept trying to raise base command on his radio, but the device remained frustratingly silent. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. This was definitely not a scheduled training exercise. The weapon's fire was too intense, too indiscriminate. Their attackers weren't trying to capture or simulate killing the squad members. They were genuinely attempting to eliminate them all. But who were they fighting? And why? Through the smoke and confusion, Sarah caught glimpses of their attackers. They moved with military precision, but wore no recognizable uniforms. Some appeared to be dressed in civilian clothing, while others wore mismatched pieces of military gear that didn't belong to any single armed force. Their tactics were professional, but their equipment was eclectic, as if they had assembled their arsenal from a dozen different sources. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't enemy soldiers or opposing force instructors. They were mercenaries or possibly militia members who had somehow infiltrated the training area. The fact that they were using live ammunition against a group of trainees could only mean one thing. This was either a terrorist attack or some kind of rogue operation that had gone completely off the rails. Sarah's survival instincts, honed by years of navigating dangerous neighborhoods, kicked into overdrive. She began analyzing their tactical situation with the cold detachment of someone who had learned to compartmentalize fear in order to think clearly under pressure. The attackers had positioned themselves to create a deadly crossfire that covered all the obvious escape routes. They had night vision equipment and superior firepower. Most critically, they seemed to know exactly where the squad was located at all times, which suggested they had been tracking the group for hours. The trap had been expertly laid, and Sarah's squad had walked directly into it. But Sarah also noticed something that her panicking squad mates had missed in their terror. The attackers' positioning, while tactically sound, was not perfect. They had arranged themselves to cover the main avenues of approach, but they had left small gaps in their coverage pattern. These gaps were tiny, perhaps only a few feet wide, and they would require precise timing and exceptional reflexes to exploit. But they existed. More importantly, Sarah had spent the last several hours mapping the terrain in her mind as they moved through the swamp. While Corporal Hayes had been relying on his compass and GPS unit, Sarah had been unconsciously cataloging landmarks, water depths, and potential hiding spots using the same spatial awareness skills that had kept her alive on the streets of East LA. She knew this section of swampland better than anyone else in the squad, possibly better than their attackers. Sarah realized that she might be the only member of her unit who could navigate them out of this killing zone alive. The problem was convincing her squad mates to trust her leadership when they had spent months treating her like a liability. Even in their current desperate situation, Sarah doubted that Corporal Hayes would be willing to follow the tactical advice of someone he considered useless baggage. Another burst of gunfire erupted from the darkness, and Sarah heard Private Chun cry out in pain. He had been hit, though from his continued shouting, it sounded like the wound wasn't immediately fatal. But, without medical attention, he would bleed out within the hour. Sarah made her decision. She began low-crawling through the mud toward Corporal Hayes's position, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had learned stealth as a survival skill rather than a military technique. The route she chose took her through a narrow depression filled with stagnant water that provided concealment from the attacker's line of sight. It was filthy, cold, and uncomfortable, but it was safe. Sarah reached Hayes just as he was attempting to coordinate a fighting withdrawal toward what he believed was a more defensible position. His plan would have led the squad directly into the teeth of the attacker's strongest firing position. "Corporal," Sarah whispered urgently, "that way is suicide. They have overlapping fields of fire covering the entire northern approach." Hayes turned to glare at her, his face streaked with mud and sweat. "Martinez, what the hell are you doing here? Get back to your position and stay down." "Sir, I've been watching their movement patterns. They're positioned in a classic L-shaped ambush formation, but they've left gaps in their coverage. I can get us out of here, but we need to move now before they reposition to close off our escape routes." Hayes stared at her for a moment, clearly torn between his instinctive distrust of her abilities and the desperate nature of their situation. Another soldier screamed in the darkness, and the sound seemed to galvanize his decision-making process. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. Sarah quickly outlined her plan. It was risky and would require split-second timing, but it offered their only realistic chance of survival. They would need to move in small groups, using the terrain features Sarah had memorized to mask their movement. The first group would create a diversion, while the second group evacuated the wounded. The third group would provide covering fire, while everyone else escaped through a narrow corridor that Sarah had identified in the attacker's coverage pattern. Hayes listened to her proposal with growing amazement. The plan demonstrated a level of tactical thinking and situational awareness that far exceeded what he had expected from any trainee, much less one who had consistently struggled with basic military tasks. "How do you know all this?" he asked. "Because I've been paying attention," Sarah replied simply. "And because staying alive has always been my specialty." Hayes nodded grimly and began passing Sarah's instructions to the other squad members via hand signals. The response was immediate skepticism. Several soldiers seemed more afraid of following Sarah's plan than they were of remaining pinned down in the killing zone. Private Johnson, despite his shoulder wound, was particularly vocal in his objections. "You want us to trust our lives to her? She can't even pass a PT test." "Johnson, shut up and listen," Hayes snapped. "Martinez knows something we don't, and right now she's the only one with a plan that doesn't involve all of us dying in this swamp." The authority in Hayes's voice cut through the squad's panic and doubt. One by one, they began moving into position to execute Sarah's escape plan. As they prepared for what might be their final coordinated action as a unit, Sarah felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For the first time since enlisting, she was operating in her element. The chaos, the danger, the need to think quickly and move faster. This was the environment where her unconventional skills could finally shine. All those years of dodging gang violence and surviving on the streets had been preparation for exactly this moment. The girl they had called useless baggage was about to prove that sometimes the most valuable cargo is the kind nobody expects to save the day. Sarah's plan unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch, each element clicking into place exactly as she had envisioned. The first phase began when Privates Williams and Rodriguez created a diversionary attack from the eastern flank, drawing the attention of 3 attackers and opening up the narrow escape corridor Sarah had identified. While the enemy fighters repositioned to address this new threat, Sarah led the evacuation of the wounded through a maze of fallen trees and standing water that she had mentally mapped during their earlier movement. Private Chun, bleeding from a leg wound, was supported between 2 squad mates as they followed Sarah's whispered directions through the darkness. The route Sarah chose seemed impossible to anyone watching from the outside. She led them through water so deep it reached their chests, under fallen logs that required them to crawl on their bellies, and across patches of unstable ground that would have been invisible to anyone without her intimate knowledge of the terrain. But every step was calculated, every turn designed to keep them hidden from the attacker's line of sight. Behind them, the diversionary team maintained their harassing fire, making enough noise to convince the enemy that the entire squad was still trapped in the original position. Sarah had instructed Williams and Rodriguez to use specific firing patterns that would create the illusion of a larger force while conserving their limited ammunition. As they moved deeper into the swamp, Sarah found herself falling into the rhythm of urban survival that had kept her alive during her childhood. Every shadow was evaluated for potential threats. Every sound was analyzed and categorized. Her breathing remained steady and controlled even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The most critical moment came when they reached a stretch of open water that offered no concealment whatsoever. They would be completely exposed for approximately 30 seconds while crossing to the next stand of trees. Sarah knew that if even one of the attackers spotted them during this vulnerable phase, the entire escape attempt would collapse into a bloodbath. Sarah held up her hand, signaling for the group to stop and wait. She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of the battle behind them, using her experience reading the ebb and flow of violence to determine the optimal moment for their crossing. The gunfire reached a crescendo as Williams and Rodriguez launched their most aggressive assault yet, forcing the attackers to focus all their attention on the eastern flank. This was their window. Sarah led her group across the open water in a low crouch, moving as quickly as the wounded soldier's condition would allow. The water was ice-cold and thick with vegetation, making each step a struggle against the sucking mud of the bottom. But they made it across without detection, disappearing into the tree line just as the enemy fire began to slacken. The second phase of the plan required even more precise timing. Sarah needed to coordinate the withdrawal of the diversionary team while simultaneously guiding the main group to a predetermined rally point where they could regroup and assess their situation. Using hand signals and whispered commands, Sarah orchestrated a complex ballet of movement that gradually extracted all surviving squad members from the killing zone. One by one, they slipped away from their fighting positions and melted into the swampland, following routes that Sarah had planned to minimize their exposure to enemy observation. Private Johnson, despite his earlier skepticism, found himself genuinely impressed by Sarah's tactical acumen. "How did you know they wouldn't have sentries covering those approaches?" he whispered as they regrouped near a cluster of massive cypress trees. "Because I watched them deploy," Sarah replied quietly. "They set up their ambush to catch us moving along the obvious paths. They didn't expect us to go through the deep water because they assumed we wouldn't know the terrain well enough to navigate it safely." Corporal Hayes checked his watch and realized that Sarah had managed to extract the entire squad from a seemingly impossible situation in less than 20 minutes. 3 soldiers were wounded, but all were alive and mobile. They had lost most of their equipment in the hasty retreat, but they still had their weapons and enough ammunition to defend themselves if necessary. More importantly, They were no longer trapped in a killing zone with no escape options. Sarah had given them back their initiative and their fighting chance. But their ordeal was far from over. They were still deep in hostile territory with no communication linked to their base. The attackers would realize soon enough that their prey had escaped, and they would undoubtedly begin searching for the squad's trail. Sarah knew that their current position was only temporarily safe. "We need to keep moving," she advised Hayes. "They'll start expanding their search pattern within the hour, and this area will be one of the first places they check." Hayes nodded and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "Which way do we go?" Sarah had already been considering this problem. Their original extraction point was almost certainly compromised, possibly even under enemy surveillance. But she remembered seeing a series of drainage ditches during their approach march that led toward an old logging road. If they could reach that road, they might be able to signal for help or even make contact with a passing patrol. The route would take them through some of the most treacherous terrain in the swamp, including areas where the water was deep enough to drown a person and the vegetation was so thick it would be like moving through a living wall. But Sarah was confident she could navigate it safely, and it was their best option for avoiding recapture. "There's an old logging road about 2 miles southeast of here," she explained to Hayes. "The terrain between here and there is nasty, but it's our best shot at reaching friendly territory without running into another ambush." Hayes looked around at his exhausted, wounded soldiers and made the decision that would define his career. "Martinez, your point. Get us out of here." The words sent a shock through the entire squad. In military culture, assigning someone to walk point, to lead the formation, and be the first to encounter any dangers ahead was a gesture of ultimate trust and respect. It meant that Hayes was willing to stake all their lives on Sarah's judgment and abilities. Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders like a heavy pack. But she also felt something else she had never experienced during her military service, the absolute confidence of her fellow soldiers. For the first time since enlisting, she was being asked to do something she knew she could excel at. She adjusted her rifle strap, checked her compass, and began leading her squad deeper into the swamp. Behind her, 9 soldiers who had once considered her a liability now followed her lead without question or complaint. They had seen what she was capable of when the stakes were life and death, and they were beginning to understand that strength came in many different forms. The girl they had called useless baggage had become their lifeline, and she was determined not to let them down. As they disappeared into the dark waters of the swamp, Sarah felt a strange sense of pride wash over her. She had finally found her place in the military, even if it was in the last place anyone would have expected to look for it. The journey to safety would test every skill she had learned on the streets and every lesson the military had taught her. But for the first time in her life, Sarah Martinez felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The journey to the logging road took 4 grueling hours, during which Sarah's reputation underwent a complete transformation. Every decision she made proved to be correct, from the safest routes through the deepest water to the best hiding spots when they heard helicopter rotors in the distance. Her squad mates began to understand that her struggles with traditional military tasks had masked abilities that were far more valuable in real combat situations. When they finally reached the old logging road, Sarah immediately identified the best location for a defensive position and organized the squad to provide security while they attempted to signal for help. She had noticed power lines running parallel to the road, which meant they were near some kind of infrastructure that might allow them to make contact with the outside world. Private Williams, who had never spoken to Sarah except to complain about her performance, found himself genuinely awed by her tactical awareness. "Martinez, how did you know about these power lines?" he asked as they set up their perimeter. Sarah pointed toward a barely visible break in the tree canopy about half a mile away. "You can see where the trees are shorter in a straight line. Power companies clear their right-of-way corridors, so you get gaps in the forest cover that are visible from a distance if you know what to look for." It was a level of observational detail that none of her fellow soldiers had even considered, but it was exactly the kind of information that Sarah had been unconsciously collecting throughout their entire ordeal. While others had been focused on immediate threats, she had been building a comprehensive mental map of their surroundings that included everything from terrain features to infrastructure markers. The rescue came just as dawn was breaking over the swamp. A search helicopter spotted the signal fire that Sarah had directed the squad to build using techniques she had learned from her grandfather, who had served in the Marine Corps during the Vietnam War. The pilot later reported that the fire's location was so strategically chosen that it was visible from several miles away while remaining concealed from ground observation. When the helicopter touched down, the pilot and crew chief were amazed to find the squad intact and in good order despite their harrowing night. Corporal Hayes had already begun composing his after-action report in his mind, and he knew that Sarah's performance would be the central focus of his recommendations. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the attack. They had survived. The assailants had been members of a domestic terrorist cell that had planned to kidnap military personnel for use in a propaganda video. They had infiltrated the training area using stolen identification and had been tracking Sarah's squad for hours before launching their assault. The attack had been precisely planned and professionally executed, with multiple contingencies and escape routes prepared in advance. According to the FBI agents who briefed the squad after their rescue, their chances of survival should have been virtually zero. The fact that they had not only escaped but had done so with minimal casualties was being described as nothing short of miraculous. But Sarah knew it wasn't a miracle. It was the result of years of hard-earned survival skills finally finding their proper application. Every instinct that had kept her alive on the dangerous streets of East Los Angeles had contributed to their successful escape from the swamp. The military's response was swift and comprehensive. Sarah was recommended for the Bronze Star Medal for her actions during the attack, making her one of the youngest soldiers in her unit's history to receive such recognition. The recommendation cited her exceptional tactical awareness, decisive leadership under fire, and selfless dedication to the welfare of her fellow soldiers. But the real change in Sarah's status came from her fellow squad members. Private Johnson, who had once openly questioned her presence in their unit, became one of her strongest advocates. During the medal ceremony, he stood up and addressed the assembled crowd of officers and dignitaries. 6 months ago, I thought Sarah Martinez was the weakest link in our squad, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was especially wrong about what makes a soldier strong. Sarah showed us that real strength isn't about how much weight you can lift or how fast you can run. It's about seeing what others miss, thinking clearly when everything is falling apart, and never giving up on your teammates even when they've given up on you. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Sarah found herself thinking about her grandmother's words from so many years before. Maria had always told her that everyone had gifts, but that sometimes it took the worst situations to reveal what those gifts really were. Sarah's military career trajectory changed dramatically after the incident. She was selected for advanced training programs that emphasized reconnaissance and intelligence gathering rather than traditional combat skills. Her unique combination of street smarts and military training made her invaluable for operations that required unconventional thinking and exceptional situational awareness. Within 2 years, she had been promoted to sergeant and was leading her own reconnaissance team on missions throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Her squad members, all of whom had volunteered to serve under her command, knew that following Sarah Martinez into dangerous territory was the safest assignment they could draw. The nickname, useless baggage, became a running joke among her former squad mates, but it was used with affection rather than cruelty. They had all learned that appearances could be profoundly deceiving, and that the person who seemed least likely to succeed might actually be the one who saved everyone else when the situation became desperate. Sarah kept the original roster from her first training squad framed on the wall of her office. Next to each name, she had written the lesson that person had taught her about leadership, courage, or perseverance. Next to her own name, she had written simply, "Never let anyone else define what you're capable of." Years later, when Sarah was training new recruits at Fort Benning, she would tell them the story of the night in the Georgia swamp when everything changed. She would explain that military service was about more than physical fitness and weapons proficiency. It was about recognizing that every soldier brought unique strengths to their unit, and that true leaders learned how to identify and utilize those strengths rather than dismissing them. Her favorite part of the story came at the very end, when she would describe the moment she realized that being called useless baggage had actually been a gift. It had freed her from the pressure to conform to other people's expectations and had allowed her to develop her own unique approach to military service. Sometimes the greatest advantage you can have, she would tell her wide-eyed trainees, is being underestimated by everyone around you. When nobody expects you to succeed, you're free to succeed in ways that nobody sees coming. Sarah Martinez had learned that redemption wasn't about proving other people wrong. It was about proving to yourself that you were capable of far more than anyone had ever imagined, including yourself. In the end, that was the most valuable lesson the military had taught her, and it was one she carried with her for the rest of her distinguished career. The girl who had been dismissed as useless baggage had become one of the most respected non-commissioned officers in her division, and her story became a legend that inspired countless other soldiers who felt like they didn't quite fit the traditional military mold. Sometimes the most unexpected people turned out to be exactly the heroes the situation required.